Scott, by now you've mentioned Afghanistan quite a couple of times. It's a country that you know very, very well, and we're all painfully aware of the difficulties of the transition in Afghanistan right now, especially given the withdrawal of US troops. Um, let's assume that a couple of aliens knock on your door and they say, listen, we've been watching this now for decades. Last war has now taken 20 years. Why is it so difficult? What's happening? Can you tell us what's going on? And then a related question is, what if they told you that actually, you know, this democracy building exercise was not very successful, and we're looking around and we see that some authoritarian regimes are not doing so badly, so why not a good dictatorship? You know, 50 years of a good solid authoritarian rule in Afghanistan, and you'll have better development outcomes for everyone. So, what are your thoughts on these questions?
Well, on the first one, the last person who was able to impose an authoritarian regime on Afghanistan was Genghis Khan. And what he did is the first time in central Bamiyan that the people rebelled against him. He just killed everybody and brought in Mongolians to repopulate the place. Ever since then, everybody who tries to impose an authoritarian regime fails. And that's because it's a very consensual kind of political setup where the whole idea is that you mobilize factions around the consensus on who's going to govern it. I think that's built into the settlement pattern, right? That you have pretty sophisticated urban centers that are involved in very long distance trade, but ungoverned spaces in between them, right? And if you look at the history of Afghanistan, you'll see that every single province, even though there's not very many people in these areas, has always been the center of a world empire. And the way they did it was always a puzzle for me. I went out to the World Heritage Monument, the minaret at Minaret of Jam, right? And there can't possibly have been more than 15,000 people in this empire that extended from Pakistan to Iran and across India. So how is that even possible, right? And this is the reason: is that they would mobilize very large numbers through alliances of different kinds that existed for the function of attacking everybody else, bringing back some loot, and they would eventually fall apart again. And we still see this model at play in Afghanistan. That when a foreign invader comes in, actually everybody can unite against that one, right? And as soon as that threat goes away, then the internal factional fighting starts all over again. What's made it more complicated in the 20th and 21st centuries has been the role of neighbors. So for a long time, Afghanistan was pretty isolated and able to attack other people. But starting in 1979, and actually, beginning with the British, like everywhere else in the world, that's screwed up today. But after that, right, starting in 1979 with the Soviet invasion, and it became part of the Cold War apparatus, that's still playing itself out. So if you look at where the factional divides are, right, you have the Taliban on one side, who were the Pashtun resistance against the Russians. Now you have the Tajiks, which is the northern alliance in the country, which is what the U.S. was supporting, the Mujahideen against the Russians, and that factional divide is still there, each with all their different alliances. So you will never understand Afghanistan if you don't look at the geopolitics of that region, right? Pakistan thinks that an unstable Afghanistan helps them in their ongoing struggles with India. Iran meddles less than it used to, but it used to see it as they're supporting Shia against a Sunni incursion from one side. And I gotta say, what if you want a sort of amusing take on this? You remember who Steve Bannon was, the former guy's sort of policy advisor? Once said he's actually smarter than he seems, even if he is a bit of a jerk. But one thing he said is, let's see what would happen if the U.S. just left, right? Would Iran want to see a radical Sunni state backed by Pakistan on its eastern border? He said, of course not, right? Would Russia ever plan to go back into Afghanistan, right? That will never happen again. They learned their lesson on that one. Would China like to see unstable Islamic radicalism coming up through the Wakhan corridor straight into where the Uyghurs are? So they're going to stop doing this. They said and his version is, the only thing holding all these countries together is that the United States is there. So if we were to just leave, the regional powers would work out a solution for this. I'm not sure he's right on that last one. They could still use Afghanistan like a stomping ground, but he does highlight the point that the geopolitics of Afghanistan are fundamental for understanding what's actually going on there today. Right. Now, within that, what you have is, and I wrote an article on this fairly recently, right? The extent to which Afghanistan is a relatively poor country, and when it's not attacking other people, it doesn't have that many resources. the resource that it has ever since the United States went in is an unbelievably wild amount of money coming in the form of foreign aid. So politics in Afghanistan are not about who gets to control industrial policy, or should we be pushing an export-led agricultural livestock program, or doing like they do in Ethiopia, where they just do a green revolution. It's all about who has access to the aid flows, right? And so if you don't understand that, you can't understand the sources of instability or corruption, or where the directions might be able to go. And that's why what the U.S. is doing now is actually fairly dangerous, right? That what the U.S. wants to do is get out, which is entirely understandable. But they want to get out in a way like we sort of got bored with this country, so it's time to go somewhere else. So let's just put in an alternative government and watch, let them have an Afghan-owned solution to this, even though we sort of set the stage, provided the director, paid for all the costumes, wrote the script, and now we can say the play is your problem. So I don't see this as a particularly sustainable kind of solution. Now, Ghani, who, for a long time, he was a close friend of mine, and that's where I worked, the president, is also an extremely bad manager. He took all his skills from working in the World Bank and brought them to the Afghan government. So everybody is polarized, right? Nobody gets along. He wants to be in charge of everything, micromanages these things. So rather than build an inclusive coalition that would have involved buying off some of the factions, he now has them all sort of united against him. And the U.S. comes in, and they all say, if you just get rid of him, we'll play along with you. Right? And that's what the next week conference in Istanbul is all about, is how to set up an interim government. I was just commenting to someone on how ironic it is that we finally get rid of Trump, right? And a human rights, ethically based foreign policy, the first thing it's going to do is cut a deal between religious fundamentalists and opium smuggling warlords to replace an elected government and put that in place. So just to answer your question on that, I just think the short version of this is it's complicated. But the longer version of it is that you can't understand it without looking at the geopolitics and the politics of foreign aid as being accelerants on what was going on inside Afghanistan. And we're now in year 50 of that dynamic.
So just kind of tagging on to this idea of the politics of foreign aid in Afghanistan, because I think it's a fascinating topic, and it's also something that, as you alluded to, is not a particularly recent phenomenon. I mean, maybe the scale has grown over time, but there has been some kind of subsidy from an external actor in Afghanistan since the 1800s. And so in a country like that, when you look at it, it seems as if as long as the international community is the main source of funding and as such creates the economy, the people who are going to control the local economy are the people who can access the aid rents, which are the local warlords. So how do you break that cycle, or how do you begin to build a sustainable domestic demand that can actually run an economy and grow it over time and create those jobs that will, for example, wean thousands and thousands of farmers off opium farming and help kind of get Afghanistan perhaps on a growth path?
Well, I'd start off by saying the one thing you're not going to achieve is weaning them off the one successful export industry that they actually have, right? That's highly technified and well integrated into every value chain you can think of. I would not start there, right? Now, to be more serious answer on your question, someone actually said that we have no there is no Afghan war. There's a one-year war that we keep renewing every year. So there really hasn't been much of a long-term development strategy for Afghanistan, because you can see, to answer your question, it's actually not all that hard. Many countries, it's hard in one way, but not hard in another way, right? Many countries have faced this, right? Indonesia in the 1980s was a heavily natural resource dependent economy. It was desperately poor. It was all based on exporting oil and wood from the outer islands and transferring a fraction of that to the inner islands where most of the people were. But essentially what it was an oil-based kind of economy. Today it's a G20 member, and it's entirely self-sustaining economically. Afghanistan, what happened is they completely fooled themselves on the kind of economy that it has. So if you look at the statistics from 2002 to 2010, they show 10% growth per year. Obama comes in and says we're leaving, and that 10% suddenly became -4%. Right? It was entirely based on the aid flows going into the country. Now, what did that do? Michaela, you're an economist on this. So what's the first thing that's going to happen if you take a country whose annual budget is $400 billion and suddenly there's $14 billion in it, right? Right? You start to see the kind of distortions that you would exactly predict. So they can't export anything because they produce the same thing Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan do, except at 5 times the price. So there's nothing they can export. Right? They also, it becomes much cheaper to import everything. So even though they grow oranges in Jalalabad, they buy them all from China. Right? The same, and this is the entire economy is built this way. Right? If you go to the southernmost part of Afghanistan and you buy a chicken, it comes from Brazil. Right? These are not that hard to produce domestically, but there's absolutely no incentive to do that. The second thing is, when I got to Kabul in 2002, there were 400,000 people in the city, and it really was a pleasant historical city in many ways, despite having been bombed by various factions. Now there's 4.5 million. Right? The city is nowhere near set up for 4.5 million people, and if you fly over Kabul, you will not see a single factory in the entire city. The whole city is a bedroom city. Right? There is no industrialization of any kind, and that's 4.5 million who live one form or another from the aid transfers that are going on there. So you've had what's called Dutch disease in modern economics, right? Which is that you go from tradables to untradables, right? As a wildly distorting factor across that economy. The third thing is that all the violence means that everyone has a short-term investment perspective. Why would you possibly, including the drug lords, right? I would have no objection if all the guys selling opium say, let's launder our money through property in Kabul. But they don't. They launder it through property in Dubai because it's so much more secure in Dubai than it will ever be in Kabul. So all your basic economic factors are fixable, and they're pretty easy to figure out what they are. Now, how do you act on those, right? You're going to have to get past that fragility, and you're going to have to find a way that you have shock absorbers for that gigantic amount of money so it gets spent on things that aren't so distorting, right? And now we're, 20 years into this. There's still less land under irrigation than there was under the Taliban, right? And it's an agricultural economy in a desert. Right? You don't have irrigation. You're not producing anything.
Scott, you've just mentioned how aid complicates the delicate balance between the different social groups in Afghanistan and their complicated history. One of the popular arguments against aid is precisely that actually it comes into a very complicated context. It exacerbates different divisions, and it makes changes to the local political economy. And essentially the counterpoint is, give war a chance. Let them figure it out. In the short run, it could be a high human cost, but in the long run, things can even out. What's your take on that?
Well, for Afghanistan, it's stupid, right? Your basic problem there is that aid came after 30 years of war, not before, right? And like I said, that your single leader on that, right? It sort of ignores the geopolitical problem that you don't have the kind of infrastructure that would allow for a North Korea or a Vietnam party type of system. So all you would guarantee out of that would be more conflict, right? So I just don't see the link, right? And I do think that one thing, as critical as everybody is, and rightfully so about what aid in Afghanistan does, you also have to take a look at and be reasonable about what were your expectations of what was going to happen. Right? In 2002, when I first got there, and I'm developing a community development program, they tried to tack on, right, that we would have a component that would pay the SWIFT charges. You know what SWIFT is? The international money transfer system, because the Taliban hadn't paid theirs for 20 years, so you couldn't even move money into the country. Right? Women's literacy was 0. Right? Average lifespans were 42 years old. Right now, they've gotten it up to 65 average lifespan. Women's literacy is women under 20 is about 65%. Right, some of the core institutions are functioning, but were people expecting? There's not to divert attention, but there's a book by a historian whose name I forgot, but he talks about how Sean Willens, right, how the United States had a democratic constitution in 1789. The first time they had a real democratic election was 1829, so 40 years later. Right? And he's right about that. They didn't have a party system. They didn't have registries. They didn't have rolls, something like that. we're 20 years into a country that was totally destroyed, right? And it's easy to see all the things that went wrong, but there are things that went right, right? And you do have a lot of, I mean, if you go to Afghanistan now, if you had been there in 2005, they have nothing in common, right? It is much more developed than it was. It's not where we wanted it to be, but where we wanted it to be was also pretty unrealistic, right? Even the World Bank's fragility report says it's an average of 35 years, right, before a conflict-affected country recovers. And that's after the conflict stops, right? So they have all that sort of econometric analysis showing that. But the problem is that, the United States is bored with Afghanistan, so they want to leave. And therefore, a lot of the metrics justify how everything failed. And I do think, like I said, that I think it was Eisenhower who once said that we didn't actually defeat the Nazis, we just overwhelmed them with the scale of our economy. And we have that problem in Afghanistan as well, that rather than think through what are the areas that would lead to growth, right, we just poured tons of money into every single contractor's idea of what to get done. And that's had a negative effect. But I wouldn't pretend that nothing has happened, and that's why you're seeing a lot of pushback by the Afghan population as well. And if you're following this, I think Johan, you are following it pretty closely. Nobody involved in these Istanbul and alternative interim government ideas is asking the Afghans, what do you think about this? How would you like to have a Taliban interim government made up with people who couldn't get 2,000 votes when they tried running in a legitimate election, right? And so what you're dealing with, again, is great power politics that want to leave. And I think it's a little unfair to push all the blame onto the Afghans as opposed to short attention spans and bad policy.
So Scott, on Afghanistan, let me set the stage for you. Imagine you had complete power. You're all powerful. And then ignore any realities on the ground or anything that's like a realistic solution. So then, can you let us know if there were 1, 2, maybe 3 or more things that could be done in Afghanistan that would help that country get on a completely different path from the one it's been on for, let's say, the last 200 years? What would those things be?
Well, since you've given me all power, right, I would ask Australia if I can take one of their Pacific islands and move Afghanistan there, right, where we so that we don't have any neighbors to deal with, right? So my big picture version of what I think should be done from a development side. This is what the paradox is. Ashraf Ghani, the president, right, made his career as an academic, writing about how you need to think about the functions of the state in new ways when you're dealing with fragile states, right? And I think he's right about that. The only problem is he didn't do it, right? So the first thing I would do is have a very strong center of government that's able to coordinate the tools of what a Bavarian-type bureaucracy is able to mobilize, right? And I would have done that in a more inclusive way, so it's not just Gilzai Pashtuns running everything inside from the middle, but that you have enough technocrats in the main ministries, right? So the fact that, you see it right now, they finally put in a halfway decent finance minister, and the next day you see he's up at the border looking at customs, which is the main source of revenue, and finding that 90% of it is going off to local warlords, and he's trying to fix that. And each of these ministries, at the center of government problem, is a fundamental problem. The second thing I do from a macroeconomic side would have been regional integration, right? You have big energy exporters in the north of Afghanistan, gigantic energy consumers south of Afghanistan, and all they have to do is get the energy from the north, which is I think about 8 cents per kilowatt hour, to the south where it sells for 14 cents per kilowatt hour, and it has to go through Afghanistan. So energy transmission, water transmission, transport, right? A regional integration strategy was where I would begin, and I would be running to China and hugging them for the Belt and Road Initiative to come right through Afghanistan if I could, right? Because you're going to need a fair amount of capital to make all of that happen. And to do trade agreements on that scale, it takes a while. So if first is center of government, second would be regional integration on making that happen. Third part would be that instead of doing 34 branches of government and 79 major ministries, I would pick 5, right? And say we got to get basic services to the population so that they see that all these things that are going to take a long time, like electricity towers, right? I also get something along the way. Right, and they haven't done that, right? So and it's not, and what you have are endless numbers of pilots, and every sector wants a small project. I would have national service delivery programs so that everybody in the country is able to see that you can at least count on 5 or 6 basic services. Then the fourth area I would do, you said I only get 3 wishes, but I want to throw one more in, which is that where the Taliban are beating, Johan's heard me on this before, where the Taliban are beating the government hands down is any notion of social justice, right? And that's both formal justice and informal justice. And because it's a weak presidency that is built out of a coalition of various political factions, the amount of land grabbing that goes on, right? The amount of local level abuse that people see every day is like a recruiting agent for the Taliban. Their justice system is terrible, right? It's along the lines of you do what we say, and if we don't like it, we shoot you. It's still more popular than going through the government justice system or any form of local dispute resolution. So that would be my four big areas would be those.
So no, I think it's definitely is worth a lot, and it's very thought provoking. One thing that's because there are, for example, these large, as you say, power transmission projects that are in place or that are being developed. There are, as you say, China wants to pull the BRI through there up to Central Asia. So not just one, but many projects stand to provide significant incentives and significant gains for all regional powers. What are, in your mind, the main obstacles to realizing that? I mean, Pakistan is obviously, we have a clear issue, but even other countries in the region who are not perhaps pulling their weight towards realizing these plans. How could they be incentivized to do that?
Well, no, I actually think most of the other countries are pulling their weight, right? And so Uzbekistan's offering to co-finance rail connections, for example. They want to put up $500 million for their leg of the link. Afghanistan is now importing wheat from Kazakhstan instead of Pakistan. It used to be 60% dependent on Pakistan. That's down to 30% now. Iran has actually, I was there for this. We were trying to broker a deal between Iran and the United States to cooperate on opium smuggling, with Australia being the honest broker between them. And it was the U.S. that broke off the connection. But even now, I think this is going to be an area of possible cooperation between Iran and the U.S. as part of the good faith gestures to go back to the nuclear deal. So I think the potential there is pretty high. India, I think you would have to, the bottom line area on international side is India, Pakistan. You would have to convince India to close most of its consulates and do a few things on their side as part of brokering a deal with Pakistan on that. Pakistan is the rogue player in all of this, right? And you'd have to be able to find a way that, the money for this is coming from the Gulf, mostly Saudi Arabia foundations that go into the Pakistan support network, and the ISI from Pakistan. So you'd have to focus on that from the regional side. But in terms of the regional cooperation, I actually think it's doing okay. And one smart thing Ghani did was whenever they catch a foreign terrorist in the Taliban or in ISIS, he doesn't put them in jail. He sends them back to their country of origin, where they usually execute them. Right? But the value of that is a real clear statement that he's not allowing any attacks on the neighbors, right, coming from Afghan soil, right? And the only area where he has to be tougher on that is on the Pakistan Taliban side. So what's been happening for a while now is that Pakistan's policy is not just anti-India. It's as long as the Pashtun Taliban are attacking Afghanistan, it means they're not attacking Pakistan. So they're really worried that if there were to be a peace agreement of some sort, all the Pakistanis who are now in Afghanistan will go back to Pakistan and be troublemakers there. So I think that's one of the key nodes, is getting this Pakistan linkage more under control, one form or another. But in terms of regional cooperation, I don't think it's that. I think they're doing fine. Right? The weakness on the Afghan side is the center government problem, right? Is that they can agree at the macro level on all these agreements. The fact that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which runs them, never communicates with the Ministry of Finance, which has to pay for them, means that they get the agreements and then nothing happens, right? So each of them, the electricity transfer, the water transfers, the railway connections, each of them takes 20 years longer than it has to.
Scott, I'd like to go back to something that you mentioned early on in our conversation, which was that when you first had your interview at the World Bank, you thought you had screwed it up because you were too brutally honest, too direct. You were asked a question about politics, and you spoke up. Well, it's very obvious that this is one of the traits that set you apart as a development professional. And I'd be very curious to know sort of how did you manage to keep that up throughout your career, to speak the truth to power and to be direct.
I'd say there were two things that made it possible. I did come close to getting fired a couple of times, whenever they would try and put in one of the sort of standard bosses. But so first of all, I actually had pretty good managers through my entire bank career who would put up with me. right. Now, to get beyond the individual personality, I would say there were three different things. The first is on that resettlement program, the bottom line is we were right. So we actually had the facts, and the senior managers, the regular managers, all tried to sweep them under the carpet. But the senior managers, and we had a very elite senior management focused strategy, could see what a time bomb this was, right? In the middle of demonstrations outside the World Bank about environmental destruction, right? If they couldn't tell an honest story about how some of these dams are displacing 500,000 people at a clip, right? And their reports looked like they knew nothing about this. They knew they were going to be in big trouble. So at the very top level, we had high-level anchors that would back that sort of thing, even though a lot of the mid-level people, one of the ones said if he saw me walking down the streets of Bethesda, he'd run me over with his car, right? So you had really strong opposition at the middle, but we did have those high-level anchors, and that was a big lesson for me on thinking through that you have to have champions for these kinds of work to get away with it, right? In Indonesia, it's pretty much the same story. The standard sectors, right, hated the community development work. They just thought it intruded into what sectoral programs should be doing, and they didn't want to have anything to do with it. But the country directors actually backed it, right? And that's because, again, your bottom line metric for a lot of Indonesia work is going to be, does it disperse any money in a way that the government is able to accept? So as long as we could go from, instead of just having studies with recommendations, to show that even in the middle of the crisis, right, you can get $250 million out the door, despite the fact there were 7 civil wars, is a pretty big selling point for any director. And the same was true in Afghanistan, right? That the community development work is by far the biggest project in their entire portfolio. So sectors can criticize it as much as they want, but no country manager is going to say, I'm going to cut off my right arm just because these guys are unhappy about it. And that's what I keep telling, the bank tries to move more and more into this sort of knowledge space than the social people do, but you still have to deliver something. You can't just be more studies. That's what universities are for. Right? So the second part, if the first part is get a high-level anchor, the second part is to actually deliver. And the third part is a certain amount of, there's a thin line between monitoring and evaluating and public relations. Right? And we sort of straddle that line between looking at a lot of evidence on things that would work, but also being able to sell it in ways that many people could read, and bringing in NGOs and journalists and other people who would also see that, even though it's World Bank and it's debt and you hate debt and so on the other hand, you have villagers saying that for 40 years we've wanted a road and we finally got one, right? So there's a certain amount of that goes on. And I'd say the last point from my point of view is I am an outlier on these things, right? And a lot of people do knuckle under to the institutional conformity. It's very seductive, right? If you want to get promoted, you want to get rewarded, people start pulling back on things they know, or they'll say that we can only talk about this in strict confidentiality. Actually, didn't really care that much. I've never really liked the bank per se, right? So the interest for me was the kind of work that we were doing, and if they didn't agree with it, I'm happy to go somewhere else. But I don't think that's the normal path for people. It becomes very much a lifestyle that you get used to, and it's very seductive. So you're not even aware of it as it sort of sucks you in from the inside. But it never particularly appealed to me from the beginning.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to wrap this interview up on. We started the introduction saying that you're a maverick thinker, and I think you just kind of underlined that point very well. So I think some of the key takeaways that we have gotten from this is really the critical importance of adapting to local conditions, the lack of enough interdisciplinary work, and how that can really harm the way that projects are implemented and their effectiveness, and also the importance of differing or making a difference between a tool and a strategy, and recognizing how institutional incentives actually favor the former, whereas perhaps it would be more conducive to long-term development if they favored the latter. So with those words, we wanted to thank you so much, Scott, for being here with us today, for taking time out of your schedule and getting up at 6:30 in the morning in Jakarta.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Great. Good luck. I hope this series is a big success.
We hope so too, and to all of our listeners, we want to say thank you for tuning into F-World, the Fragility podcast, and we hope that you've found our conversation with Scott today interesting and inspirational. We sure did. So please subscribe where you listen to podcasts, and if you want to know more about F-World, please visit our website f-world.org and follow us on Twitter at F-World Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.